I have a speech defect which will occasionally show. In any case, I have a cold. So Hungary is a free country. If you can't stand it anymore, you can run screaming from the room. 30 years ago, almost to the day, I wrote an article a short one, about Bauer. I won't call him Peter because I did not, alas, ever meet him, in which I used the old joke, traceable to Schopenhauer, that there are, of course, 3 stages in the acceptance of an unusual idea. The first stage is that the idea is absurd and ridiculous and outrageous. The second stage is that it's so obvious that any fool knows it. And the third stage is that it's true and important and I invented it. And I think 30 years ago that wasn't true of Bauer. It wasn't true that his ideas formulated so presciently in the 1940s and 1950s had been widely accepted in economics or anywhere else. But by now, I think he is at the third stage. And indeed, what's embarrassing is that so many other economists and political scientists and so forth have spoken Bauerish ideas without realizing that he spoke them first. I speak of an old colleague of my father's at Harvard, Edward Banfield, who wrote in the 1950s about the cultural obstacles to growth in southern Italy. I speak of Robert Bates, who wrote in the 1970s about the marketing boards in East Africa without, it seems, knowing that Lord Bauer had spoken of them in the late 40s and early 50s in West Africa. And Bill Easterly, as has been mentioned, says the same things, as did Banfield before, about foreign aid that Bauer articulated. Now, I was once a Marxist, a sort of an unscholarly Marxist, a lefty. I've overcome that disability. And we left-wing Americans in the 1960s thought that foreign aid was just grand and assuaged our guilt at being rich, whereas the Africans and Indians and Chinese were poor. And Bauer understood right from the get-go what's obvious from the core of economic theory, which is that free money is corrupting. Like power, free money tends to corrupt. Because if you're not being rewarded for some desirable behavior, like going to work in the morning, you're very liable to take your leisure, as I am now being retired. In other words, I think the most unusual thing about Bauer in his early work and throughout his life was that he understood what we called in the old days at the University of Chicago price theory. Price theory. I once wrote a book, which I'm going to do a third edition soon, called the applied theory of price. And it's the Chicago School view, but it's also the mid-19th century liberal view, the pre-1848 view of how an economy works. Not perfectly competitive, a disastrous phrase which was introduced in economics in the late 19th century, because no thing in this vale of tears is perfect, but workable, pretty good. If prices approximately reflect the opportunity cost of the resources embodied in them, the economy works pretty well. And indeed, what's more important than this static assertion, which was understood very well by 1848 in what they called at the time political economy, is that it's a dynamic encouragement to innovation. And that's something that the Austrian, or I should say the Austro-Hungarian, because they were both, economists of the late 19th century and early 20th century vividly understood. That an economy of prices that bear some relation to cost, unlike under socialism, guide us in our new ideas, our innovations. This attitude that Bauer had, this understanding he had, this grasp of supply and demand curves and prices and incomes and opportunity cost, has been constantly under challenge since 1848 in economics, under the heading of imperfections in the market. Imperfections in the market. I just wrote an essay, a couple of years ago, I wrote an essay on this matter, in which I counted out the number of imperfections that economists have claimed to find in the price system, this supply and demand routine, since 1848. And I discovered that there were 110 of them. And indeed, the way price theory is taught in economics, routinely everywhere, is to start with 1 week on this understanding of 1848 that the economy works pretty well, and with, we go like this, supply and demand curves, and then spend the rest of the term or the year on the numerous imperfections, monopoly, externalities, in investment externalities, informational asymmetries, blah, 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 for which in recent times some economists have received Nobel Prizes. Now, what's shocking about this fact in the doctrinal history of economics is that none, I emphasize, not one of these 110 imperfections, flaws in the market, have been shown to be important. In light of, now hear this, the 3,000% increase in real income per head since 1848 in countries like Italy and Japan and Finland, not to speak of England or France. 3,000%, a factor of 30 increase in the ability to purchase goods and services. What I've called and call in my wonderful books, one of which is here. This is the thickest of the 3 books I wrote on this. The others are nearly 500 pages each, which are available on Amazon.com. I'm an American. I believe in commercial free speech. Not commercial free, but free speech that is commercial. These, by the way, are available in spoken books, too. You can read them in your car. But I argue that this is the most important secular fact in human history, and it tells against the claim of imperfections. If this economy that we enjoy in Hungary or in the United States were so terribly imperfect, we would not get a 3,000% increase in real national income per head. I make merry in the paper that I'm summarizing here, which is available on my website. You can Google my name, you'll find it, and on the website of the institutes involved. I make merry of Thaler's Nobel Prize last fall, in which he combined the 257 cognitive biases that psychologists have discovered, 257, with the 110 imperfections in the market, so the market can't save you. So it's a miracle that we can cross the street without government guidance. And that indeed is his conclusion, that we all need to be nudged to keep from falling into a hole. So in other words, Bauer, in this enthusiasm he had for the core of economic thinking, was a classical liberal. He was introduced by you as a conservative. And that's often how people are classified. I suppose Margaret Thatcher thought he was. But he's not. He's not a conservative. He's not in favor of tradition. In fact, he's rather alarmed by the growth-killing traditions as he saw them of India and China and so forth. And he's a liberal, a word which is not honored much these days in Hungary. But I would claim that he had a deep pessimism about economic growth and culture, and the role of culture in economic growth. Now, we Americans are more optimistic, and a contemporary of his, Theodore Schultz, who was a colleague of mine and was a Nobel Prize winner as well, took a more cheerful view, but in substance the same as Bauer's, that ordinary people in India and China and Latin America were able to understand prices and opportunity cost and behaved as though they did, and that they shouldn't be looked down upon and manipulated by people from the World Bank. But we in the United States, at least in the character of Schultz and some others, thought that ordinary supply and demand curves could overcome the trammels, the obstacles that came from culture, whereas Bauer was not so optimistic. The example I have in mind these days, having just been at Dr. Mingardi's invitation in Italy for a few days, is southern Italy, which in the case of Robert Putnam and Edward Banfield and lots of others, is viewed as the hopeless case, as the case where amoral familism or familyism is a permanent obstacle to economic growth. And many people in northern Italy have the same opinion about the South, that anything south of Rome is hopeless and corrupt. Certainly corrupt, but not hopeless. And I think this is a mistake. I think that if southern Italy were cut loose from its annual subsidy from northern Italians via Rome, it would behave like other countries that have opted for liberal economic policies, such as India and China most spectacularly, and it would grow and come to equal Hungary. Well, maybe it does equal Hungary now, but it would become rich. And I think the force of culture as an obstacle to growth is, even in its direction, greatly easy to exaggerate. We think of holy India as this place of saints and anti-growth beggars and so forth on the street. And yet think of the Lord's Prayer in Christian Europe. Give us this day our daily bread. The comparable prayer in Hinduism is the prayer to Durga, the mother goddess. Give me longevity, fame, fortune, sons, I wish she hadn't said that, or wealth. Every day, Hindus say that. So they're not, as in his optimistic moods, Bauer said, they're not immune to the influence of price and income. And that comes through, I think, in some developments that Bauer didn't have the good fortune to see in his formative years. And that is the astonishing economic growth since 1991 in India and since 1978 in China. So Bauer, for example, assaults Sir John Hicks's theory of economic history, 1961, I believe it came out. And in a long book review, he attacks Sir John's economistic theory of how the world developed. Hicks thought that it was just a matter of markets expanding. Markets expand, all is well, said Hicks. And this struck Bauer as perfectly absurd. The cultural obstacles, he's quite indignant about this. The cultural obstacles to economic development are ignored in Hicks, he says, and it's outrageous. What this fool. Hicks said at one point in this book, which, by the way, was widely attacked. My mentor, Alexander Gerschenkron, attacked it in a most amusing review, and Bauer did, and lots of other people. Hicks said at one point, a country could become rich, now hear this, in a couple of generations. And this particularly stuck in the craw of Bauer. He said, this is nonsense. What are you talking about, a couple of generations? This is the work of centuries, he implied. But he was wrong. It wasn't the work of centuries in the case of India and China. India and China have grown every year 7 to 10% per capita in real terms since they turned away from, in the case of India, Gandhian London School of Economics socialism to something approximating the mid-19th century liberalism that in other moods Bauer advocated. The experience of Latin America is still another laboratory. From the 1940s, and Juan Perón and Raúl Prebisch, there was a long period in which one Latin American government after another experimented with protectionism, import substitution, they called it, which sounds much better than protectionism, or much better to speak of the current American tariffs on steel and aluminum, a tax on the citizens of the country you're trying to protect. And it didn't work. Latin America had shockingly low growth by comparison with these explosive growths since 1978 for China and 1991 for India. Yet in the last 30 years, repeatedly, led in as a model by Chile, a country where I've taught more of the Chicago boys than Milton Friedman did, me personally. Their liberal policies, unfortunately introduced by a tyrant, still is a problem in Chile, that liberalism is associated with Pinochet. But when it's been tried, it works. And when the opposite is tried again and again and again, on the internet you can find young people these days saying, we ought to give socialism a try, as though it hadn't been tried in Hungary and Cuba and various other places. Come now, we've tried it. In Venezuela, as we speak, they're trying it full bore with not satisfactory results. And so I say that economic growth and the cultural improvements that accompany it. The first of this series of wonderful books is called The Bourgeois Virtues, Ethics for an Age of Commerce. And in there I try to show that it's not true that if you gain the world, you lose your soul, which is a very common conservative opinion about economic growth and the economy. So I don't think that culture, institutions, the need for that magic word infrastructure, which is a kind of a license for the government to do everything, is the right way to move forward. What we need is a change in attitudes towards the entrepreneurs, towards the merchants and manufacturers. It's not so much that they change in psychology. I argue this in detail in these books. It's not like Max Weber, who said that the business people themselves, their minds change because they become Calvinists or something. No, that's not it. What happened between the 16th century and the 19th century, places like England and Holland, was a massive change in attitudes towards these people. The rest of the society signed on to what it amounted to liberalism, which I argue inspirited great masses of people to invent, to innovate. Innovation itself was a bad word in English until the 19th century, and then became what we love. So I think this Hungarian Brit had it right early on. I have to end with a Hungarian joke. The great Italian-American physicist Enrico Fermi was in a group of physicists, large numbers of them Hungarians, and he wondered if there are alien civilizations in this enormous universe that by the early 50s we had come to understand, where are they? Where are the aliens? Who would probably have a much more advanced civilization than us. There's been enough time. Why aren't they here? To which one of the Hungarian physicists said, Enrico, they're here. They're just called Hungarians. Thank you very much. I'll be glad if we have a few minutes, have we?
Yes, absolutely. I was going to say, would you like to act as your own chairman?
I'd be glad to chairwoman in this case. What would you like to say? In an American audience, there'd be 12 hands up already, but Europeans are more shy. There's an Englishman. He's not shy.
Well, as a matter of fact, of course, I want to agree with you that Peter was primarily a classical liberal.
Yes, indeed.
And there's no doubt about this, I think. Of course, to an extent, there were conservative elements in his thought as well. But I wanted to ask you, what is your response to the argument of, I think, Amy Chua, who has suggested that when differences emerge, and Peter pointed very clearly to societies like Germany and Malaya, where different cultural groups, different national groups, had different aptitudes and therefore different levels of success.
Yeah.
And his view of that was, of course, that's terrific, fine, let everybody do what they want to do. And
That's the key.
yes, but of course, Ms. Chua says that's going to result in sort of low-level civil war, and sometimes not low-level either, between these countries, between these groups. And I wonder, what's your critique of that argument? And secondly, if you accept it in whole or in part, how you would respond to it? How you would?
Well, I don't accept it. But here's the force of the attitudes of the rest of the society. If the rest of society hates Jews because they're successful at commerce, then you're going to get the Shoah eventually. I heard a shocking number from Janusz Kornai, with whom I dined a couple of nights ago. Janusz said to me that when you ask high schoolers in Hungary what percentage of the population in Hungary is Jewish, they say 20%. Because there's this use of anti-Semitism by politicians to raise a specter. And we in the United States are now becoming very familiar with this technique. The Mexicans are coming. Oh, the Mexicans. So I think it's about politics. It's about the use of splits in society in politics. If you take a 19th century liberal view, John Stuart Mill, or 18th century, Adam Smith, if you take this view, part of the deal is that you accept tolerance. You accept and you honor the Chinese in Indonesia, to take another example. Whereas if you want to, you can take the view, and there, unfortunately, some politicians in Indonesia and Malaysia are taking this view, those damn Chinese. So I think what we need is liberalism. We don't need hateful nationalism. That's the way forward. Yes. Bring the microphone back.
Thank you. Welcome, and thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. My name is Sándor Kerekes. My question to you is this. There is a great wave of populism surrounding us, especially in Europe. And the US is not free of it either.
The Philippines?
Obviously, it has consequences in the economic field eventually. And so I would like to ask what your views are, what is to be predicted, what is to be expected in a country like Hungary, where liberalism is shunned, it is vilified.
I know.
And even the economy, in practical terms, is turned away from liberal principles. Right. How long can it last? And will this be a competitive economy at last?
Again, I think we should turn to Latin America for historical lessons here. And exactly what happened in Latin America after Juan Perón. I mean, first it was simply, what's the Spanish word for it? But anyway, there were bosses. And they didn't have any particular ideology. Indeed, in the 19th century, they often had an economically liberal ideology. But in 1946 in Argentina, Juan Perón, so to speak, reinvented the European populism of Mussolini and Hitler and whoever it was in Hungary, I forget his name. And that didn't work for Latin America economically because it entailed, for example, protection of natural resources. It was an absurd but common assumption in Peru, Chile, Mexico, that those places were actually rich by what they meant, by which they meant lots of mineral resources. And it's only because of the international conspiracy, Jewish conspiracy often, stealing the profits from our natural resources that we're poor. So we must, as in Mexico early on, nationalize the oil industry. And it didn't work. So the illiberalism, it's a happy conclusion, because making people free, which is all liberalism is, and leaving them alone to make their way, with some help if they can't make their way. I call myself a Christian liberal. I do believe we have an obligation towards the poor. But I think that not only makes people free, which I regard as in itself a good thing, but it makes them rich.
Thank you for the wonderful speech. I want to ask you about the fragility of this whole thing in many ways.
Yeah, of liberalism.
If we think about Latin America,
Hold it closer.
if we think about Latin America, for example,
yeah,
we see some experiments that went in the right direction, more or less.
Yeah.
But even in those cases, we have huge backlash. I mean,
Yeah.
Chile is an interesting example of that.
Yeah.
I mean, people were unleashed in their economic freedom. The country became richer. And at a certain point, when you got a certain amount of diffuse wealth, people turn into socialism. And, that's the story of Europe up to a certain extent.
Yeah, it is.
People got enriched, and then they drifted into a search for protection or welfareism. I get your point about China and India, which is different than Bauer. Culture can change very quick.
It can, very
but
much
like
so.
in Latin America, culture can be stuck with old fallacies for a long time.
But in most of these cases, economically, it does not fall back. I mean, take Chile, for example. It hasn't fallen back to pre-Pinochet incomes by any means. And Hungary's not becoming poorer right now. And as someone said, it's not likely to immediately, only the long run. But the front, so to speak, to take a military analogy, the front on which we need to work is ideology. Not mechanical, as Peter Bauer would enthusiastically agree, not mechanical plans for government intervention to fix everything. For example, the independence of a central bank is now doctrine in Latin America. And it is pretty much in most countries now. People realize that the disasters in my own country and many others in the 1960s, especially the 70s and early 80s, in making the central bank into a free money place for the government was a disaster, the printing of currency. Now, people need to be reminded of this repeatedly. I think the reason we keep getting generations of socialists is we all grow up in families. This is something widely neglected by modern economists. We all had moms and dads. And the moms and dads provided us with free lunches, manna from heaven. And then at the dinner table, things were equal. If they had called out for pizza, it wasn't that the dad got most of the slices because he had paid for them. So when people who don't grow up on farms or small businesses come to notice that there are poor people in the world or in their own country, their first instinct is to go for daddy's wallet and move to socialism. This hypothesis of mine is a testable one. I'm not sure it's correct, but it seems plausible. It's my own case, for sure. That's why I was a socialist once. Thank God, I'm over it. Yes.
May I have a short comment? First, I would like to defend Europeans. We are not so shy as you suppose. The fact that we didn't raise our hands immediately was not because of our shyness, but because of the fact that we agreed more or less with your introductory remarks, and I was trying to find something I could disagree.
Okay, good.
It was difficult, so I agreed with all your presentation. I got a point in your first answer to the question. It seems to me that you see liberalism on the one hand and nationalism as the totally opposite phenomena, which I absolutely disagree with. Nationalism is not necessarily only a negative thing, and I think that the respect for a nation state, the acceptance of a nation state as a meaningful, legitimate entity is the starting point for our thinking, at least here in Central Europe, in Hungary, I guess, in the Czech Republic and elsewhere. So I can't accept to say that I can't be a liberal. Surprisingly, accepting. I don't think that.
Surprisingly, I agree with you.
Why surprisingly? It's so elementary.
It's hopeless. The first generation of liberals were people like the founding brothers in the United States and the nationalists in Italy, and the proud Englishmen and Scotsmen in Britain. And there was not felt to be any conflict between nationalism and liberalism. Au contraire, But I don't need to tell you that, in fact, it's the same answer that I gave here. Nationalism can be used in this way. There's a wonderful English translation of the Finnish national anthem, whose music is by Sibelius. And it's a beautiful tune. We sing it sometimes in my church in this English translation. And the first verse says, "Finland is wonderful. Look at all these lakes and trees and rocks. Isn't it wonderful?" And then the second verse says, "But other nations loved their country too. And there's nothing wrong with that. And we should respect each other as Czechs and Hungarians and Americans and British and Indians and whatever, French too." The French make it hard, but still, we'll try. But no, so you're perfectly right. There's no just as there's no necessary, you could say, anti-Semitism doesn't need to be used as a political club. Unfortunately, there's a long history in Europe and now in the Middle East of it being used this way. So we end up in hopeless agreement.
Thank you. I'm also a trained economist, but I'm also, as critics say, part of the development aid industry since 37 years. When I started to work 81 in Tanzania, I was absolutely convinced that with a liberal market economy, we will see another economic miracle.
Yeah.
But then we realized, and you mentioned it, there were not entrepreneurs in the sense of Schumpeter.
Yeah.
So my question now, what comes first? Do we need an environment which creates entrepreneurs, or do we need entrepreneurs to create the environment?
We do not need, I would claim, an environment to create entrepreneurs. That's the standard view of entrepreneurship, that we need to, and this is Max Weber again, that we need to change the psychology of people so that there are more entrepreneurs. I don't think that's very plausible. There's been innovation always in human history, a little bit, much more after 1800, but I reckon, what do you think? 10% of any population are entrepreneurial, or would be, if the surrounding ideology in the society honored them. But if the surrounding ideology says that the way to distinction is through politics, or war, or for that matter, art, or scholarship, and that being in business is dirty and shameful, or, as the case is in many poor countries, that all your third, fourth, and fifth cousins descend on you when you make a little bit, and you're required to take care of them, then you're going to have problems. So you need the ideological change. And as I say, that's the front on which we ought to work. We ought to be saying to people, as I say in my wonderful books, don't sneer at the business world. It's got its sins. It's got its Enrons and now Facebook. It's got its sins, but so does government. So I don't take it to be hopeless. I mean, look, we were taught when I was a kid, I was raised as a transport economist with special reference to economic development, and we thought India was hopeless. I mean, after all, most of them are Hindus. What bigger obstacle to economic growth could you possibly think of than being a Hindu? And some of them are Muslims. That's almost as bad. But it was silly. It wasn't true. India overcame it spectacularly, and will. In 2 generations, if they keep going the way they are and they don't shoot themselves in the foot, as we Europeans did in August of 1914, if they don't shoot themselves in the foot in 2 generations in about 40 years, India will have the same income that the United States has now. Imagine the cultural explosion, the art, the music, the science, indeed the entrepreneurship that will result in, for us all, for the benefit of us all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I want to thank you very warmly indeed, Professor McCloskey. First of all, I want to quote something, just to pick up your last remarks. I was speaking to a world-famous entrepreneur who's taken a small business and turned it into a huge multinational one. Yes, and what he said to me was, it's best to think of enterprise as a kind of artistic impulse. Yes. He said an entrepreneur is someone who looks at a Jackson Pollock painting and sees within it a painting by Michelangelo, or I should say in the case of Michelangelo, even better, sees in the block of marble the David sculpture that can be produced. And secondly, I'd like to say you've started a lot of arguments, and those arguments are going to go on for the rest of the day. So I want to thank you very warmly indeed, and I want finally to thank you for your explication and criticism and assessment of Peter Bauer. I think it really advances us to a better understanding of him. I wish he were here. He would have enjoyed it enormously. Thank you very much.
I would also agree with him.
I would like now to break for coffee. I look forward to seeing you in 15 to 20 minutes. Thank you.